Hey everybody, how you guys doing? So yeah, this video is a little bit about a month overdue, so thanks for being patient with me. And yes, welcome to a wonderful lecture on Hinduism and Eastern thought. Eastern, Western, human thought, and all of that. So yes, today gonna be ranting and raving and doing a song and dance about Hinduism. So, I am going to be following along with the notes on Hinduism from my website, and I have an entry on Hindu philosophy for reading, as well as there are selections of the Vedas and Upanishads that I often like to have people read. I have been finding links to those online, free primary text, which is what I prefer to do. So Hindu is the name, the Persian name for India. And Persia and India are somewhat next door to each other, traded for thousands of years. Our society borrows the Anglophonic world, and me, being American, borrow the English term from the British. They got their term from the Persians. So, as you can see in the Vedas, and as scholars have talked about, Hinduism is an incredible tradition because it really brings together elements of what all sorts of religions and cultures, not from those religions, but brings together as a strange interconnected group of pretty much every belief kind of under the sun in the name of something or other, and just kind of brings it together and says, yeah, it's all sort of one religion, is a lot more, in certain ways, diverse in its beliefs than a lot of other practices, and just thought, okay, we can stick all this together, it's kind of monotheistic, it's kind of polytheistic. In the Abrahamic world, very much somewhat ditched polytheism, has cults of saints and other things, and spirits and jinn, but somewhat ditches animism and polytheism for monotheism. Hinduism speaks monotheistically, but it also keeps the polytheism, keeps many different types of gods, keeps karma. Many ancient societies believed in something like reincarnation. You have that, plus in Hinduism, the release for an eternal afterlife. So you find a whole kind of cornucopia mixed bag of things in Hinduism that are quite incredible. So you find not only monotheism and monotheistic kinds of tendencies, if we want to say monotheistic rather than pure monotheism, where there is all one, there is truth, there is unity in the whole and in being itself. Being itself is a very philosophical kind of consideration in India, Greece, and China. And so you have many different gods, many different parts of the same family, of the same God, of the same whole, of being itself. That you find this in Hinduism quite a lot. So you can find animism and local traditions, local gods then, and then those together in gods of gods of gods, and then a spirit and all. You could find all of this. There are several different schools of Indian thought that we're going to talk about. The schools of Indian philosophy are divided into the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox, the unorthodox, non-Orthodox schools of Indian thought. Orthodox schools are Hindu. Non-Orthodox schools are non-Hindu. So anything that's Indian that isn't Hinduism, and they are interrelated, and they share beliefs across the different groups. The three major religions and philosophies of India, there are many, but the three major ones are Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. It is believed, it has been taught in the past, that Hinduism was the primary one, and then that spawned Jainism, and then Jainism turned somewhat into a guy who went by the name of Buddha at some point, or was called that by other people, and this spawned one of the major world's religions, Buddhism. The three major traditions of world thought are Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, which is very much the West, the Middle East, and the East of Eurasia, Africa, and all of that. And we have the Americas out here. And yeah, that is very much the West, etc., being Christian. And also, so very much the East, which is a lot of things, and everywhere is a lot of things, is very much a lot of Buddhism. Which is the major system out that a ways. So you have the Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Islam, as well as Judaism, of course, which are out more in the West, but also in the Middle East, where Islam, of course, still very much has its empire. Although it is colonialism, post-colonialism, everything is the world situation. And yes, all of that. So, Hinduism is an incredible tradition that brings together many different texts and sources. And what happened in India is that as Hinduism was being brought together, there were many different old oral traditions, long memorized oral cultures, which is how the Greeks, Indians, and other cultures often have their pre-literate cultures carried down, is memorized long traditions. You have the Homeric epics, which were also lyrics and understood in rhyme and song, or aids like that when people did not have texts, which is why people had long oral recitations as traditions. Some of the primary Greek philosophy first texts are written as odes and epics, and written in essentially poetry and song, not as prose writing out longhand, well, ABC, which is something one finds in both the East and the West. Both first early recording in song and verse and poetry, philosophy, religion, and then people start to have texts and they start to write out long arguments for this or that. You find both in India. So the Vedas are the primary early oral traditions. Those are then boiled down into what are known as the Upanishads. The Upanishads, what Schopenhauer, one of the great German philosophers, called the greatest wisdom of humankind. That the Upanishads are the inner teachings of the Vedas, are the philosophical Golden Age of India, trying to express what is philosophical and inner essence, the oneness in the manyness, again, of what is going on in the Vedas and with the gods and the gods, the god and gods and all of that. Oftentimes, the message of the Upanishads, which we will cover today, is you are that is you, all is one, there are other perspectives out there as you have perspective, which is a very good thing to teach human beings. And yes, it's an excellent thing in general to teach people about life. So then you have after that, you have the Vedanta. Vedanta means Veda's end. I realize I don't even need these headphones on. I don't know why I was... Yes. The Vedanta is Veda's end, which means that the Upanishads are the cooking down of the Vedas, and then the Vedanta are the putting together of the ideas of the Upanishads and the Vedas. And there are Vedanta centers in Berkeley, San Francisco, I'll mention, which were popular in the 60s and took root in the 60s, which is people trying to work out the philosophy, psychology of Hinduism. If you're into that, you can get into it. I have not gotten well into that. There's Vedanta centers I want to visit. I have not. But yeah, if you're interested in the psychology of Indian philosophy, Vedanta is the way of getting deep into that sort of practice. So all of this came together over a very long period of thought, of time, history, and thought. We imagine people have been compulsively thinking the whole time. About 2000 BCE, India was invaded by people who have been called the Aryans. In fact, Iran, specifically during the years of Germany doing things in the world, Iran actually called and renamed itself Iran, which actually means, in a certain sense, Iran was naming itself officially Aryan land, which actually means, of course, Middle Eastern people. There's the garbage truck outside. Hopefully the construction and trucks don't bother you guys too much. There really aren't convenient times, you know. But yeah, essentially, the Aryan people, which of course I'm a white guy, you know, I am rather large and white, which means I have seniority, you know, got more square inches of whiteness. Yes, it's a good joke, sort of, maybe. Basically, we do know, and the Nazis thought they knew, that there were Aryan invasions from the area of Iran, essentially what would be very much Persia, early on into India. And it has been said in the past, and in fact the Nazis were, and others at that era, were fans of the idea that the Aryans invaded, and that's what civilized India and civilized a decent amount of the world. We now think this was somewhat known as the Dorian invasion and other interrelated things. Technically, we have a history now which says the West is sort of superior, but no longer gives the specific sorts of explanations that used to be given just recently in the past, which now no one believes anymore. But if you are interested in why the Nazis have the swastika, and such, I do have an image in the notes, which some artist made, taking an image from what looks like, or drawing it with Ganesh attacking the Nazis, and it says, "The Nazis stole the swastika, Ganesh wants it back." I love that image. And yes, they are banging things, of course, outside. So yeah. basically, we do know that long before the Aryans, however, that area had a lot of plumbing. Of course, plumbing and graves get buried in the ground, and we get those the best, which means obviously people cared the most about graves and plumbing, we know via anthropology. It's kind of like that Motel of Mysteries book. I love that. Yeah, the stuff that seems best preserved is not necessarily what the ancients valued the most, but it is what's buried underground rather than the wooden huts, like, wearing away with nature. So we do know that before the Aryans, the Indians had great plumbing. I forget the name of the civilization off the top of my head. I have that here. Is a yes. Somewhere in the notes. But yeah, essentially India was actually civilized before Aryan invasions and things, but those Aryan invasions did possibly have monotheistic influence on the area, which caused Hinduism to react back and forth, Hinduism becoming Hinduism at the time, Indian culture becoming what would become Indian culture, and as they were coming together with groups, that basically they were being invaded and conquered in different periods. And so during the Vedic period, which is supposed to have been around 1500 to 800 BCE sometime, the 4 Vedas were composed and written down as oral traditions, that the foremost being the Rig Veda, R-G-V-E-D-A, Rig Veda, of which there are, many different passages. I used to give a reader and put passages in the reader. I am trying to find the links to the online text as best as possible, and the parts of the text, of course, that are most philosophical, which are celebrated. The Golden Age of Indian thought then follows that period somewhat. The Golden Age of Indian thought is slightly ahead and overlapping with Greek thought, and then the Chinese era of golden philosophy is somewhat a little bit overlapping and later than Greece. It's not that one has to be first or later, but if people do think that the Greeks were the first to be philosophical and such, technically the Indians are slightly ahead than the Greeks, and India is bleeding over into and exchanging culture with, we know, and in many ways, Greece and China. If you think about how India is between Greece and China, if you think how the Greeks had trading colonies out by India, knew who the Indians knew who the Greeks were knew who the Indians were, that will be much clearer in the lectures about Buddhism in the future, talking about Ashoka and his grandfather, etc., and their fights back and forth with Alexander, etc. Well, not Ashoka. Alexander was safely dead. But yes, that the Greek and the Indian worlds were interacting, and the Indians had philosophy slightly, it would seem, a little bit ahead of the Greeks, but the Greeks also had philosophical poetry and were slightly ahead of the Chinese, but there's so much good Indian and Greek and Chinese thought that you really don't have to care whether somebody's slightly 100 years ahead of anybody, and of course you can wonder whether or not that makes a lot of difference, because of course these are human insights into human wisdom and common situations. So, all of this is the period, though, between 800 and around 200, and people push the dates this and that way, and I'm making a wider window there, when the Vedas and the oral traditions were boiled down into the Upanishads, and the Upanishads, which literally means sitting down beside the teacher, which means like the secret inner teachings, what you would get if you stayed after class or if you went to grad school and you talked with the teacher, which the grad students effectively were just the students who were the best, who were allowed to stay after class and talk the most, because that's a simple human arrangement, as it still is. And so, yeah, what you have is, during the period that the Upanishads and Indian philosophy are being cooked down into major philosophical teachings, that is the very period where you find the 6 Orthodox Hindu schools forming that follow the Vedas religiously as Hindus. You have the Vedanta, which we've talked about, Yoga, which is, again, discipline exercises, Mimamsa, Samkhya, Nyaya, and Vaisheshika. We will talk about some of these, not all of these, but I'm going to talk about especially the Nyaya and Vaisheshika in a detailed lecture, because they are the logicians, and like Aristotle, and I happen to like early logic and Aristotle and the Nyaya very much. And they are very important for Buddhists, because what is the sound of one hand clapping is 2 things causing one thing, which is actually specifically an argument against the Nyaya, and then is also mystical and wonderful. And you can actually understand what is the sound of one hand clapping in a very simple, pragmatic way if you understand the logicians of the Nyaya and how they are arguing like and unlike Aristotle. We will get to that in another lecture. During this time, you find the 6 Orthodox schools. So the Hindus are turning into different schools of Hinduism. There are many schools of Hinduism, 6 specifically. I'm sure there's many, many more today. Those are the 6 major celebrated ancient schools. You have the unorthodox schools. There are 3 major unorthodox schools. That will be a major lecture, I believe, either next or following, in which you have the Sharvakas, who are hardcore skeptics who believe that really truth is just what is immediately in front of you, and the mind is very much an illusion, which is something you find in skepticism the whole world over. Life is but a dream. Many people the whole world over said, if we can dream, well, then, Steve, do we know that really what happened happened? And people, of course, have dreamed and thought something happened, and then it didn't happen. So people have wondered, well, how do we know truth? Do we know what's in our minds? All of that in various language. And so the Sharvakas say all is an illusion. The Jains and Buddhists are more skeptical than the Hindus like the Sharvakas, but they actually do not go as far in being somewhat sort of, we believe in nothing Lebowski, somewhat nihilistic skeptics, kind of like the Sharvakas. Well, nothing's real, may as well party, is what they kind of say, and I will tell you all about that. Hasn't been a popular position in human thought, ever. There were briefly Russian nihilists who confused Nietzsche, and yeah, the Sharvakas are strangely a little bit super skeptics, kind of like that, somewhat nihilistic in ways. So you have then also the 3 unorthodox schools, or not just the Sharvakas, who are barely known and kind of interesting, but you also have the major world religions of the Jains, somewhat first and foremost, though they weren't officially Jains just yet, but as they were going out into the jungle and striving along with people who were trying to figure out what is true of Hinduism deeply, along with the Upanishads and the deep meanings, they ended up accidentally, probably not intentionally to them, forming the major world traditions of Jainism and Buddhism, the Jains and the Buddhists. I teach not only Indian philosophy. This lecture can serve for a general introduction to Indian philosophy. It is also one of the core lectures for Buddhist philosophy and Hinduism, the Orthodox schools, the Logicians, the Jains, the Sharvakas. All of them are very important for understanding one of the 3 major world's traditions, Buddhism. I'll talk more about that as we get into the lectures. This is also the time that the great Hindu epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, were written, and I will talk about that very briefly in this talk. So after that period, from that point on, Indian philosophy had its golden age. I am sure there's all sorts of brilliance, and all kinds of amazingness. But the rest of Indian thought after the golden period, somewhat like Greek thought, etc., that was its heyday. And then it is pretty much people in schools of those original people. That is something you also find. Oddly enough, the world is not having French philosophers. I'm sure there's French philosophers. The world produced a lot of French philosophers in the 70s and then even the 80s and such, 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s with Sartre and existentialism and all that. But basically, France is somewhat having plenty of philosophy. There aren't major names right now that people are pointing to as like that guy. Similarly, Greece hasn't had a great period of philosophy. People aren't looking at Greece right now and pointing at people in universities and being like, that guy is the world's major philosopher. The Greeks have had it for thousands of years. India had their period of major philosophers and have known for that, and then people settled into schools, and this is basically them settling into those schools. So again, there are Orthodox Hindu schools, and then there are non-Orthodox, non-Hindu Indian schools of thought. Buddhism happens to be the largest of the unorthodox. The largest, of course, the only one of orthodox is Hinduism with its various branches and schools. So essentially, we are, while the Sharvakas are interesting, and we'll mention them, and there are other people going on who don't become the major schools. In fact, the Sharvakas pretty much died out. You find the Hindus are the Orthodox with their schools, and then the unorthodox are the Jains, who go super naked and are super non-violent and influence Gandhi. And then out of the Jains, or the proto-Jains, the people who are yet to become Jains, came a guy known as the Buddha, who you may have heard of. Again, if you're taking the Buddhist philosophy class, hopefully you knew what you were signing up for. There was some sort of guy, etc. So, yeah, That continues up until the present time, in fact. India is actually then was conquered by Muslims somewhat plenty. In North India, Buddhism survived in Sri Lanka. Hinduism, of course, survived very much. And there are backs and forths with Pakistan and others such today, and you can get all into that or not. So yeah, the British, of course, came along in the 1800s, and in fact, I'm American. Therefore, I'm going to be thinking about this definitely from the Anglophonic and modern perspective. So yeah, Britain, had India as part of the empire, and Britain has somewhat given up the empire and the military lately in order to play nice in the world. And yeah, India is one of the largest, if not largest, democracy there is. Of course, everybody calls themselves democracies. Communist countries love to call themselves democracies because, as we know, voting, means you're a democracy, unless you're a communist country or somebody we don't like, and then voting doesn't count at all because the cops can kill you. That is what we have been saying for a long time, is we can vote, they vote, but the cops can kill you there, so you know what that means. All right. So the three paths of Hinduism is basically that there are three paths of worship. This is a common way of schematizing this. It is a way that I've taught it in the past a lot. I am sure there are other ways of teaching Hinduism to people. I am not a Hindu, but Hinduism has several goals and several ways and paths that it likes to talk about things. And so I'm going to mention some of these. It's not the only way of presenting it, but it is a wonderful way of presenting the diversity of Hinduism and how there are many paths up the same mountain. The Jains and Buddhists are actually also people who say there are many religions of religions. There are many paths up the same mountain. And then, of course, all of them say, and by the way, we are somewhat mostly it. So the three paths of being a devotional, Hindu who is getting closer to the forces and all, and monotheistic, polytheistic, everything, there are several routes into the consciousness and or spirit and or being of the universe. First, there is devotional worship, pretty much traditional religion, known as Bhakti yoga. Yoga here actually means discipline or practice. Sort of like salsa just means sauce. It doesn't mean red tomato salsa, and yes, in fact, the Mayans, of course, bred a lot of tomatoes. Tomatoes made it out to the New World. They made it out from the New World to the Old World, such that tomatoes are a staple of Turkish cooking, Italian cooking. Tomatoes did not exist in the Old World, Eurasia, Africa, West, Middle East, East. Did not exist before, of course. People got those from the Americas, and then it's like tomato sauces are staple in much of Middle Eastern and Italian and European cooking. All those tomatoes tomato sauces did not exist. Yoga is basically any discipline or practice. So stretching in certain kinds of pants is yoga, but that's just one thing you can farm out for certain sorts of classes, and that's awesome. I don't mean to diss. But yeah, anything is a yoga. So philosophy is a kind of, and any particular philosophy is a kind of yoga. The term is a broad term where it can be technically used for certain things, but it also is a broad term like sauce, which means it could be used for many different things other than yoga, as people would understand it. And of course, yoga today, much love, is not as devotionally religious, specifically because, and there's many things like TM, these are practices that have specifically been somewhat stripped down in order to be able to be like religion itself, as it spreads in many ways, as we'll talk about, somewhat stripped down in order to be more palatable to all different sorts of cultures, which is what major traditions like Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism did, is kind of make everything so that it could be for a wider audience, is plenty what happens in the world. So you have three paths that are talked about: bhakti, devotional worship, doing religion, praying, singing hymns, lighting incense, performing rituals, to gain favor with gods, heavens, better favorable rebirths, karma, action, etc. It's much of what we would call religion. The two most popular forms of Bhakti Hinduism are Shaivism, the worship of Shiva, the transformer, destroyer, dancing god, and his incarnations such as Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, and Vaishnavism, the worship of Vishnu, the savior or preserver, and his incarnations such as Krishna. Worship is often called darshana, seeing or experiencing. And Hindus will say, I'm going to the seeing, meaning in a sense it's you being seen, the God sees you, you see the God, you are interacting with a specific being that has a very specific perspective, concerns, and And so, yes, you are interacting in some sort of way, seeing and being seen. Something like a viewing, which is another general word that could in a culture be used for a great variety of things, I suppose sacred things. So another common form of bhakti devotional worship is of a particular goddess or god would be Ganesh and or Kali, the sort of bloody goddess with many heads, as many are somewhat familiar with, which of course gets misunderstood by Indiana Jones somewhat fiercely and others. But yes, the second path is Raja Yoga. It's worship by meditation and asceticism. Asceticism, not aesthetic. So aesthetic means beautiful. Ascetic without a th. Ascetic versus aesthetic. These are words which are confusing and not as common in use. Aesthetic means beauty. Ascetic means that you are a monk who does austere practices, fasts for a long time, wears very coarse clothing, is deliberately uncomfortable or going without things or luxury. So asceticism is something like discipline, hardcore mental or physical discipline. In a certain sense, many people are familiar with Zen Buddhist meditation as like the most well-known form of, say, something like what we're talking about, Indian Raja Yoga. Something, and this is also known as different terms other than Raja, and I've just gone with Raja. I've seen it referred to as other things. I again, rely on my sources for this. But essentially, it is, if you are... think about, of course, if you are a traditional Christian in the Middle Ages, you are doing devotional worship. If you want to be even more hardcore, you'd go be a monk or a nun and start, say, going without food, fasting for days, wearing a hair shirt, being really hard, going out in the desert and staring death in the face back. If you live in the desert countries, it's like desert is death compared to where there's water and life. That's very overt in Egyptian and Abrahamic language. So you're going out and staring death and hardship in the face. For Indians, it's not going out in the desert, though. It's going and being a forest dweller. It's living in the jungle. Being a forest dweller is basically going into the jungle, going off into the hills and the trees, living like either a hippie or a very disciplined person, and basically rejecting society somewhat and living unconventionally. Very famous for this. We know fasting for days, standing for hours in postures or days, sitting on spikes is another famous one. You see gurus like sitting on beds of spikes and things like that. Of course, if you sit on all the spikes together, of course, it doesn't actually poke into you because of the physics, kinda. But at the same time, it's like that seems decently uncomfortable. I'm not sure how orthopedic, good for the back, any of that is. But yeah, basically doing anything that's very hard mentally or physically. If you think about Zen meditation, Zen people will sit there with their eyes closed or half closed, staring at a wall, half closed or what have you. It's hard to stare at a wall with your eyes completely closed. But basically, Zen meditation being very quiet is a very, in a certain sense, mental discipline, and doing that for hours and days would be something like Raja Yoga, mental, physical discipline. The Jains are known for standing in the jungle for long, long periods of time, and vines supposedly grow up their bodies, as you can see, especially depicted, with their saints, etc. Bahubali, again, is an image of him standing in the jungle, is possibly supposed to be the first person, according to the Jains, enlightened in this kalpa, this cycle of existence. So before the Buddha, Bahubali stood in the jungle and vines grew up his naked body, and so he is depicted as naked with vines growing up his body. He is a major Jain Tirthankara saint, god, being. We will talk about that when we talk about Jainism. So we have Bhakti Yoga, which is religion, very much devotional religious practice, communal practices of some kind. You then have Raja Yoga, which is not just being traditional and being part of the crowd, but you are going and trying to be hardcore and an athlete and or philosopher, mental disciplined person. When the Greeks came to India, some said there were the hymnosophs, the people who disciplined body and mind, and they kind of freaked them out and impressed them, including Pyrrho, who came with Alexander, the great skeptic. So yes, supposedly that yes, the beeping outside is a little bit annoying, but we'll just push through that with discipline and mental clarity. Yes. So yeah, you then have the third path, which is my favorite, Jnana Yoga, because I'm not so patient with the alarm outside, which thankfully has ended and is, like the self, impermanent, according to the Buddhists. Jnana Yoga, like jhana, sometimes spelled Jnana, is the third path is acquiring knowledge, wisdom, or understanding, either by arguing with people or being out in the jungle and fasting for days until you have insight and vision. Very much like a vision quest although a vision quest also is very much Raja Yoga, that one would achieve through debate. Logicians like the Nyaya and Aristotle would believe you achieve insight by debating back and forth. Plato says boy Socrates encountered Parmenides, and Parmenides says if you say A, not A, B, not B, C, not C, you will beat anyone. You will rise above everyone, and you will be superior. And then the audience watching that play knows they force-fed Socrates hemlock. Very much like that. That if you go back and forth with others in philosophical debate, you will gain a pathward upward to being itself, like those who discipline themselves. And these things are not exclusive, so that mixing this, obviously, it would be somewhat expected at the time. You would do somewhat devotional worship because you'd be somewhat traditional in living in your culture, and or you would be going even more hardcore than that out into the jungle to really try to do what we would understand as very bodily mental discipline and or argue with others about philosophy. It definitely looks like there were jungle people who went off into the jungle rejecting society as Hinduism was becoming popular and becoming a centralized tradition, who then also at the very same time made Jainism and then Buddhism major schools of thought and philosophy and debating with others. So given all of that, there are two goals to the process. First, there's hope for a better life. There's hope for trying to get reincarnated and trying to get not only better things next week, but better things for yourself and your family and your generations and your future lives. India is, of course, famous for reincarnation. I come from the Haight-Ashbury, and there was a bumper sticker when I was growing up that says, "My karma ran over your dogma," which I always like to joke. It's sad. But yes, there was another one, "We're objective depending on your military objectives." But basically, I don't see that bumper sticker much anymore. I don't see bumper stickers much anymore, actually. Of course, I'm in Berkeley. This town has cars where people paste a bunch of plastic reptiles to them and drive around. Still do love this town. But yeah. There is hoping for some sort of merit that you can, like sin or merit or something, where by karma you can gain a better position for your family, your kid, your future rebirths, that you are trying to work your way up the chain, as it were. However, and all of the interconnection of this is karma. I have heard people say karma is metaphysical, not physical. In a certain sense, we can debate about this. It is very much modern to think that ancient systems weren't talking about energy, when in fact I usually fudge it on the side of when people talk about karma or ergon or chi in China, Greece, and India, they are talking about physics and energy, and they're talking about it in the words that they believe. They often identify energy with fire, wouldn't electricity. Lightning is a form of fire to ancient people. They say this decently clearly. It strikes the earth, it lights up, stuff is on fire, hopefully not Steve. But yeah. People understood the world in various ways as interconnections of forces. And what is force? Well, in a certain sense, karma means action. So in a certain sense, karma is not only the physics, and Indian logicians talk about this. Karma is not just the physics that moves your hand around. If you move your hands around in unethical ways, it gets you bogged down and reborn a cockroach. So for us, of course, there's like the spiritual and then there's the material. For, of course, people very much in the same way people will think mental concepts such as mathematics are the forces of nature itself. For ancient people, the spirits and such are nature, not supernatural. Yes, they're the uber nature, but they're natural. They are material in a certain sense. It is difficult and weird to ask, how much did these folks think that there's not Ghostbuster different material ectoplasm, that it's like fire and light that the spirits are made out of. Remember, when the body dies, it gets cold and you stop breathing. So the fire and the air look like they go somewhere else. And there's fire and air upstairs in the sky. So in certain senses, when people talk about a lot of religious stuff and spiritual stuff, in certain senses, they are doing early physics and psychology. And I do like preserving it that way rather than, I'm not a religious person, but saying, so where's the fire and the light? Oh, this is what they're saying with that. I am somebody who errs on that side. Some people don't like that. I do like that. I think it makes human beings look intelligent with all of their traditions. But, people, do and don't like that. So what we're talking about is there is the working your way karmically up through action, energy, material, spiritual, all of that stuff. And various Indian schools say mind is a certain kind of substance. So all of it is spiritual. All of it is fire. All of it is alive. And it's all material in a certain way. And then again, I've gotten into interesting arguments with people whether or not Plato or the Indian philosophers are at all material about the fire and the light. And in a certain sense, they're not distinguishing the material from the spiritual in ways that people who had religion and then had the onset of modern sciences, which I can debate about a lot, what that means, what is it to believe in science or not, what is that psychologically or socially. It's an interesting set of questions. In that sense, of course, we are believing in energy or math and then saying, well, that's sort of really real. Well, that's, again, what people have somewhat done, and they did that more in terms of social forces being constituent of the world than, say, math and literacy. I am somebody, actually, who very much believes we should be careful about thinking the world is made of texts and math rather than spirits and male and female energies, because of course people who did not have text or math would have looked at the world in human terms of mothers and fathers and children and spirits and all of that, and I am a big fan of that. So in a certain sense, karma is the physics, is the energy that punches people, gets reborn a cockroach, raises your spirit up, down. But beyond those goals of higher and higher karma or not, there is hope for release into a kind of freedom and totality. This is variously described. Something like freedom, release from rounds of material, trucks rattling up and down the street and other things, and concerns and desires over impermanent trucks and existence and noises and sound being impermanent and all of these other things. Like the body, etc. There is hope for a release from these rounds and rounds of on Earth. And this is something that is shared by Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, although they disagree what those that release is, and they disagree between schools, and they get, and it is a little difficult to talk about heaven and or perfection and or the Godhead, or how much one could join up with being itself or be enlightened or objective or rational or anything. But this is sometimes known as moksha or samadhi, but in America we know it by the name of the grunge band, of course, more specifically Nirvana. I think that they were a little north of here. I'm in the Bay. I think they were up in Washington. But wherever they were north of here spiritually or physically, there is the idea of release, freedom, enlightenment, consciousness, very much gaining in the mind of the all. At least it is often referred, seems to be suggested something like there is a greater mind, there is a greater spirit, there is greater awareness. Human beings are walking around seeing they have perspective. They know and feel there is a larger perspective. And how does one work one's ways through perspective? And then there is the idea of the all perspective, which is deep peace, tranquility, enlightenment, the source of all. You do find similar talk in the world systems. I do think that it is very clearly human beings working with perspective. Beyond that, you are welcome to believe and argue for what you like. As far as I'm concerned, I can't prove Thoth is real or unreal. However, I'm not going to argue Thoth is specifically real. I am going to wonder how people came up with Thoth and why and what they're doing with that. And then beyond that, we are welcome to believe in what we want to believe. But there is something like communal objectivity, communion, perspective, something like that, as an allness, as a oneness. And we do find that people in Hinduism, there is, as shared with Jainism and Buddhism, the immediate goals and then the further goals, and then there is higherness, that is release. So what you find in the schematizing of this stuff is that you have an ultimate goal, which is something like enlightenment, freedom, mind, consciousness, nirvana, grunge bands, and then you have essentially one's with the mind on that sort of thing. You have Bhakti yoga and then Raja yoga working you as a person upward, as we'll see with some of the Buddhist philosophy lectures. If you are going to watch and continue with some of those, people will say, I'm a householder, I'm a Thai villager, I have children, I've had sex, I have eaten meat and stuff. I'm not going to be a monk in this life, but you know what? I'm going to help the community and they can get reborn better and become more enlightened. And then hopefully, if I am good enough, I will someday be reborn into a position where I could be some sort of saint and enlightened, because I know that I'm kind of screwed up down here, so I'm helping my betters, which could be abused and horrible, but actually is very much culture, of course, the whole world over, and how we negotiate, and of course anybody's systems of hierarchy definitely are a little bit, yes, scary, intimidating, as ours are continuously. So yes, there are monks and nuns, and hopefully they are working on the stuff hardcore, and as a villager, you are helping the community. We'll talk more about that. So what you have is moksha and enlightenment. Nirvana is the ultimate goal. But there are 3 other goals that are specifically mentioned that are supposed to stack up in a row like a ladder upward towards that. Very much like having the chakras in the spine line up such that you have your consciousness in different centers of consciousness up your nervous system and spine and chakras and serpent. And you have your ducts in a row, which opens your channel upward to the stuff. You will find in any yoga or other Indian related systems talk of that a lot. The 3 other goals, which stack, will go downward. So there's ultimate release, and then beneath that is discipline, dharma. That dharma, of course, is a term that means teaching, or very much like yoga. Dharma is a term that means something like school of thought, teaching, discipline, practice, morality, sort of a solid thing that you're using as a basis. I am into the conservative, progressive, kind of open, closed, open, back and forth shifting of human thought and there'll be more time to talk about all that. You find ultimate openness and kind of enlightenment, and then right beneath it you have something like strong closure, which is a sort of an opposite, a base, totally based, resulting in some kind of freedom above it. You find in Hinduism them putting goals of solidity, openness, and freedom, solidity, openness, and freedom. There's a lot of schema like this, where you're working away from solid to open to solid to something solid to fluid to solid to fluid and open. And you find this with this, where moksha and enlightenment is supported by being a disciplined person, having dharma, like Dharma and Greg, like that old show. There was a store in Berkeley called Dharma, I believe. I'm not sure what they sold there, but yes, I think clothes. But yeah, the something like traditions and rules for Jains and Buddhists, they would say that was specifically some their rules and monastic practices. You then have beneath that Kama, which is pleasure, famous for Anglophonic folks and hippies. The Kama Sutra is a manual with lots of pretty pictures in it of various yogic postures, various things. A lot of sexuality, of course. Kama Sutra would be pleasure text. The Kama Sutra, Kama is pleasure. That is beneath discipline. And then beneath Kama is Artha. Artha, material well-being. So you'll notice that in a certain sense, and this is a good scheme for life, in fact, first, lowest is material well-being. This is very Maslow's hierarchy, pyramid of needs in a lot of ways. I am thinking of that, and I am intentionally confusing these things for myself and noticing the similarities. There's plenty of differences, but it is something like once you have your material needs set, which possibly the sociopath is never totally set with, then you have on top of that higher goals. And we all struggle with narcissism and BS, with each other. And so then you have you have your food and your shelter, which Jains and other people off in the jungle are screwing with. You then, once you have that, and of course if you're living without, then you've got your basic needs nice and set, possibly. You then have higher goals, which are something like, not only are you happy, but you're also above happy, disciplined. And then above disciplined, you have open to others and enlightened. Notice, the first and foremost thing is not to be disciplined and closed, because then you couldn't be open to others. It's also not important to be happy first and foremost as highest, because then you're not disciplined as a person. So we can actually see a very easy, awesome scheme here. You basically have, once you get your needs taken care of, such that you've eaten enough, you have a roof over your head, and your children have a roof over their heads somehow in this economy, then you have above that, you have pleasure, that you're happy. Above that, you have discipline, that you are doing your vegetarian practices such that you are nice and disciplined and not allowing bad karma and other things into your life. And then above discipline, however you go to the gym or have a diet, you then have, that is for the purpose of being a good person and being open and being into everything and perspective itself, so that putting material needs first would screw everything up, putting pleasure first would screw everything up, putting discipline first would screw everything up. But if you put enlightenment and mind and sharing common perspective with all first, and enlightenment, I don't want to reduce enlightenment or nirvana simply to sharing everyone's perspective in a nice, calm way, because many people would say that's not essentially or simply what it is, but it does seem, for any general sort of human culture, you would have something like material well-being, then being happy, then being disciplined, and then on top of that, you have something like openness and freedom of mind and being able to interact with others. Notice that you have something like closure with material well-being, you then have something like openness with happiness, you then have closure with something like discipline, and then you have openness and happiness of enlightenment, nirvana, which isn't just being happy, is something like being free. One of the major lessons of ancient philosophy is actually that the goal of life is not to be happy, but to be calm, and then thus often be happy. The goal of life for a lot of ancient philosophers, I'm not saying this is true or not, but food for thought for you, is that Greek philosophers and Indian philosophers and Chinese philosophers often say the goal of life is not to simply be happier than anybody. The goal is to be at peace and to have conquered the self. That is very much a theme of Indian thought. And you can see that here, where happiness is awesome. You are supposed to have that. That is supposed to follow from stuff. If you are miserable, you are probably living your human life wrong. But if you have your ducks in a row and you're miserable, something's out of whack or somebody's out of whack, something's doing something wrong, because your ducks aren't in a row, and why. So yeah, this again is actually very similar to Maslow. I actually have to return to Maslow at some point and specifically chop that up. But knowing that, is always in the back of the head, is something where he was studying, of course, I think he was studying world cultures the world over, trying to come up with his thing. So in fact, if there's similarities, that's probably not entirely accidental. That's probably because he's surveying world cultures like this and other things and coming up with a similar thing to try to make sense of this and other things. So that's not an accident by itself, is it? So let's read here a couple of the sections of the Vedas here, just a few, and then some of the Upanishads. So there are several sections of the Vedas, and it shows foreshadowing of the Upanishads and more monistic understandings of the metaphoric narratives. I'm going to check the video here. Looks like it's working. And yeah, all is good. Yes. This is one of the first video lectures I've recorded, so again, thanks for bearing with me. There are many passages of the Vedas that kind of foreshadow the Upanishads and all of this. What I've been telling you is the way that Hinduism is somewhat distilled through the Vedas and the Upanishads. So there are a couple of passages of the Vedas and Upanishads, especially the Upanishads, which show us these goals and are explaining this scheme to people and how it works in the teachings of this and that. So let's see here. We also have the issue of metaphor. Many people would say, because we are reading stories here, I'm going to tell you stories of or mention gods and spirits. It should be mentioned that people the whole world over definitely knew what metaphor was. Indian grammarians talk about it. People definitely knew, like they had dreams. People knew that they didn't just simply think and see the truth. So they were listening to which expert has the best dream scheme idea, we would say theory, a godlike vision of some kind, which comes through more the Greek tradition of theophanies and theories, which have the theo of the God vision, where you're sharing a vision and consciousness of a God, not a text, not a textual understanding. You're sharing the spirit and vision, the eyesight of a being. Which when you think about gravity, you're sort of sharing the eyesight of gravity with other people who think about gravity in a certain way. Is more like physically sharing the perspective of your parents or the gods, would be more the way it would be understood. So people definitely did know they're saying this is like a tree. The Nyaya specifically say, if you say the scaffolds cry out in happiness for the king, like the people are like, yay, the scaffolds are like, the people on the risers are like, hooray for the king. If somebody says, well, the scaffolds aren't actually happy, that's the people, that you would be guilty of misunderstanding a metaphor. So they know that metaphors are metaphors. And this is the thing, when people talk about gods and spirits, how much do they know they know they know? And you can ask people today, what is God or the objectivity of science? And they'll be like, well, experts kind of know and I sort of know, and let me sort of explain it. But again, there are ways where, like, what is the big spirit or the big mind state? And people have trouble understanding it other than by saying it goes in a straight line. It is round in this way. It's a big bang that you can't hear through space, because through space nobody can hear you scream, is the alien line from back in the day. There's many ways where our metaphors and our use of words aren't perfect. And if you're into philosophy, it's endless understanding about how your words and metaphors are not perfect. I'm big into it. I'm frustrated with it, as we all are. But these folks, as I'm reading this stuff, new metaphors are metaphors. So it isn't just that they literally took it as true, and in fact, probably the community thought these were literal and metaphorical all at the same time. So there is a hymn to Indra, just to mention a couple of these, just a few short Vedic passages here. In a hymn to Indra, the storm father god, who was often the chief sky father god, but then was unseated somewhat by Brahman, the more abstract all god, it says we should, in the Vedas, the early sacred texts and oral traditions of Hinduism, and about one of the major gods, it says we should worship Indra if indeed he does exist. It says, if somebody wishes to purchase Indra from me for a modest price, you can return him after he has slain the demons. And they're very clearly being humorous and playful with very serious things on purpose in order to try to get people some kind of strange perspective. A hymn to the Vishvedevas asks, who has seen the one who has sprang into being itself, seen how the boneless one, the great boneless chicken, as Ram Dass might say, this boneless one supports the bony, the inarticulate, being itself, which does not have divisions in itself, which is all good and bad, which is all right and wrong, all chemicals, all reality, mental, spiritual, physical, all the divisions beyond the metaphors and the words and the carving apart of mental understandings. That who has seen this inarticulated, non-chopped up, articulated, put into pieces one that supports all the things of many pieces? What is the oneness that supports all the manyness? What is the inarticulate, as I am being, having trouble to talk, that then is articulated and broken into pieces such that things have bones and joints and can move like this, which of course they move like this, so I have different fingers and different joints, but all is one, which again, showing people hands and stuff, one of the easiest examples people would have the whole world over to talk about being, manyness, oneness, manyness. One of the interesting problems is the problem of the one and the many of the ancient world. This hand is one, this hand is many. When is it one and when is it many? Well, it's both the whole time. So how is it one as opposed to many, or many as opposed to one? Well, the mind goes this way with the duck rabbit, it goes that way with the duck rabbit, and people come up with philosophy trying to explain these sorts of things. I definitely want you to be into that. What this means to you beyond that is honestly your cup of tea. There's a lot of things to understand from here. Which would have been Indian society with many pluralities, and the Jains and the Buddhists would have been hearing this sort of text and moving on and going and doing their own thing. So a hymn to the I have just already mentioned that. So, yes, another Vedic passage here, a hymn to the frog, says that just as the Vedic priests gather together with their rituals, so too do the frogs gather around the pond, croaking to celebrate the first rain. So it's humorously saying, if there's any humor here, let's hope, that the Vedic priests, the very sacred people who are holding this text sacred and other things, they gather around and chant, oh, and things like that, like frogs sit around croaking and noticing the similarity, a little bit of naturalism, and again, some humor, some mortal perspective, and some humbleness with all of that. The Zhuangzi, my favorite Chinese philosopher, the Taoist, says, is the supreme wisdom of humans any different from the peeps of baby birds? Maybe. Heraclitus says we're all apes to the gods. Nothing we say is ever wise to the gods. Everything we say is ooh, ooh, ah, ah, ah to the gods. That's it. It's all ape speak. Every one of us looks like an ape to the gods, is what Heraclitus says. Funny enough, calling people apes has been used in very racist ways. The Vietnamese supposedly would call all white and black mixed soldiers from America who came in to Vietnam, they called them hairy apes. I do not know offhand the Vietnamese, but yes, that was the slur for white and black Americans as hairy apes, all uncivilized ape-looking people. So yeah, we're all a bunch of apes. We're all a bunch of frogs. We're all a bunch of baby birds. That's Indian, Greek, and Chinese philosophy, skepticism 101. Look at animals, look at others, look at other cultures, look at how stupid they are. Well, guess what, kid? If you think we're smart enough now to know that, we ain't, and people weren't, which is why they had some smart people, wise people occasionally telling them all that, and we still have human brains very, very much. Yeah? Which is why all this would probably be somewhat Well, at least interesting, if not, and you think one way or the other. So we're going to talk about a couple of passages of the Upanishads here. And yes, the Upanishads, again, are the Vedas and passages like that. We're getting people to ask questions. The Vedas are full of stories of the gods. Those are some of the philosophical moments of the Vedas. And the Vedas are full of long stories about the gods did this, the gods did that. There's 2 different or 3 different stories about how the gods invented fire that totally contradict each other. Just like there are parts of the Bible totally tell the same story in different conflicting ways. And all that was just gathered together. The Bible has a lot of conflicting stuff in it as a bunch of texts, and people knew it was that before they had texts that were entirely ironed through like modern dictionaries or encyclopedia or anything like that. And those have plenty of mistakes. And errors, contradictions. So just like people reading the Bible, the Old Testament, the Torah, would have seen conflicting accounts of different witness, the Vedas have wildly different stories of different things. So people studying them would have said, well, why do I believe any of this and what's really going on? And the Upanishads are people trying to figure out the philosophy behind all of this. And as the Upanishads were being turned into the secret inner teachings, the most famous line from the Upanishads is Tat Tvam Asi, that is you, which if you think this is that means other is self. The that is the this. This is a word we use to point at things that is closer. That is something we use to point at something farther away. And different cultures have various thises and that's, and we do to point at thing versus another thing. And you could say that that is a this, and then there's that beyond the this, and that you just called that when it was farther. There's ways of using these terms in interlocking ways. So that thing that is other is actually intimately you, is the Upanishad saying beneath it all is release, is freedom, is nirvana, beyond divisions of the self and other, etc. It then gets complicated because technically Hindus do believe you have a permanent separate self and soul. The Jains somewhat do believe you have a permanent soul, although they very much then believe everything other than that is very much illusion. As do Hindus a lot, but the Jains are a little bit more hardcore. The Buddhists do not believe that you have a permanent self or soul. It is all part of the same mind consciousness. So in a certain sense, unlike, say, a materialist atheist, a Buddhist would probably not think that what is your consciousness just melts away and is then not conscious at all. But everything that you would identify as your own individual self or your own soul for Buddhism would not be yours eventually, would just go back into the big fire a la Heraclitus and be part of the big recycling program. This is a point of contention between Orthodox and Unorthodox, Hindu and non-Hindu philosophy. The Jains technically are halfway there, but they are more, in a certain sense, on the Unorthodox. You really don't have a permanent fixed self, say. You sort of do, but not the way that the Hindus sort of say you have a self and a name tag and then you're just reincarnated as other beings, but then you really are the soul that has been. The Jains and Buddhists sort of believe your self is durable enough, can be reincarnated, but ultimately for the Buddhists, oddly enough, you have a soul that will be several different people, possibly, probably, but it's not completely permanently separate. It is that you're part of consciousness, so the fact that you're conscious doesn't die, but your own individuality and self would completely melt back into the whole. This is things that people are getting somewhat from the Upanishads and thinking that this is what the Vedas might very much mean, and they're pushing that with the Upanishad texts as Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism are all forming in their different ways and back and forth in terms of each other. So the Upanishads, in telling everybody Tat Tvam Asi, that is you, they ultimately, and Upanishad means sitting, upa, or near, down, sit. Upa, ni, sad. Sad, sit are interrelated languages from the Indo-European language family. I will point out that occasionally. So yes, I have the Tat Tvam Asi in the notes as well. There is an interrelated mudra. There are hand positions, and they're called mudras in Buddhism. And there are several gestures. You will see this gesture often. Jesus or other people are doing this. There is a very common gesture in Indian traditions, which is this, which I do this all the time accidentally, not even thinking about it, is this means essence or seed. When you're grasping something, of course, if you think about it, if you are with your muscle memories and mind and body and all of your nerves, if you're grabbing something and picking something out ever so slightly, you are trying to separate a thread, the inner essence of something, you would go like this. You wouldn't go like that, because that would be grabbing a bunch of stuff. You would be separating something and getting the inner essence out, ironically, of the all oneness pervasively through the whole thing. You'd be picking out the thing that is throughout the whole. There's a nice contradictory way back and forth about that. So basically, this means something like essence and you will find the Buddha and others doing this, which means the essence is kind of the deep inner whole, and real truth is the oneness of all, which is, again, something that you find in Buddhism and Indian systems. Hands, the part of the brain that controls the hands is very nearby the language centers of the brain, which is why, as creatures, we can do gestures with hands, and we're probably doing that as we learned how to talk so much with words, so I can communicate with you, again, like an Italian, and use a bunch of hand gestures, Again, as in What's Up, Tiger Lily? Would you like to see my collection of off-color Italian hand gestures? Let's keep this nice and civil, so the answer is no. So yes, the unorthodox systems of Jainism and Buddhism very much point to all oneness beyond Italian hand gestures, beyond to essentially nirvana, enlightenment, all-inclusiveness, and they're radical about this, such that they are strivers, and they are going off into the jungle and rejecting society a lot and trying to be super philosopher, yoga, mind-body people. The two most famous of these strivers were Mahavira, who was the founder of Jainism. The Jains, as we'll get to, are a bit more complicated with it. They actually think there were Tirthankaras before Mahavir. But again, modern scholarship definitely knows a guy by the name of Mahavir went out into the jungle and became pretty awesome and started developing a following. And then after Mahavir, another guy came along who was even more eventually famous and huge, known as Buddha. So all of this is all is one. And people were saying, well, if all is one and if everything is one thing and that's the highest goal, why do I have to sit around and be a Hindu and be in the increasing caste system? And I have to, while all is one, of course, the caste system is forming and people are being put in their places in civilization. Not as much as we often in modern times think, because the caste system was somewhat loose and not like entirely enforced or anything, and was probably hopeful language about a society that was not so ordered, but is very much very much a classist, and you can say otherwise, a system of stuff. So people were popping off and going off into the jungle. In fact, also important with this, Mahavir and Buddha were second-class warrior sons who were trying to be chest people, who were trying to be head people, and trying to be priest philosophers. So actually there's some class mobility in Buddhism and Jainism, you can see, which is during the golden age of Indian thought, like golden ages the whole world over, including American golden age, if we're still in it, or what have you, not sure. But there's mobility, there's people mixing around, there's new stuff going on, and so, I'm a big fan of saying that right about now. So yeah, in mixing things up, some people were popping off saying we don't even need to get into the system as it's solidifying because there's some ideas in this that are way more awesome, and they went off and then of course founded their own traditions that solidified, and then you have Buddhist schools fighting with other Buddhist schools about whether or not to stick in this or get more enlightened than that. And so the Jains a la Mahavir and then the Buddhists following Buddha basically were people saying we don't have to pay attention to the caste system, we don't have to pay attention to the conventional rules, we're going to go off and form our own cultures, which eventually became their own sets of rules and competing systems, of course, in the ways that culture often works. So yes, I have in the notes some quotes of the Upanishads that I have students read. In the first quote, it says that if you move higher and higher upward with the mind, you can see that the great thing moves, it does not move, it is far, it is near, it is within, it is outside, and that those who actually see and perceive, and what is it to perceive and see, the darshana, here the deeper unity, is it feeling, is it seeing with the eyes, is it something else? That essentially that they are, they delight and have no sorrow. It says the bodiless, the scatheless, the sinewless, those without, again, bones, articulations, tendons, the pure. That yes, and it says specifically that beyond knowing and not knowing is the greater unity. Belief, solid, doubt, openness, and beyond belief and doubt, beyond solid and fluid, beyond, closed, and open, is the greater, higher unity of all of those forces. This is a thing where I tend to believe somewhat in the Hegelian dogmatism skepticism scheme, which is that there's belief and doubt somewhat fighting throughout history. It then gets messier than Hegel with Nietzsche, and there's a lot of interesting things to say about it. But if history is somewhat of a messy perspective battle, then yes, there is something like a greater all beyond, and we work through it as best as we can. And we do that by knowing and unknowing, and there are many Indian, Greek, and Chinese systems of knowing and not knowing. Parmenides tells boy Socrates, which is actually Plato telling us all these words as the playwright, that if you do knowing, not knowing, knowing, not knowing, belief, doubt about A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you will become the sage connected to the forces of all, and people will, many, try to kill you, because you will rank them easily and show how foolish they are, and they won't be able to hang. And like mortal human beings, what do mortal human beings do when somebody comes along who is way superior, who they can't handle? Well, they kill you, and then worship you once you're dead, and they can tack your body to something. I don't know. So yeah, essentially that very much for Kierkegaard and other pensive Europeans, much later, that would be Jesus and Socrates, specifically, and of course the Greek-ish and the Roman-ish and the Israelite-ish is for Europe, their heritage. Of course, it's the Celts and the Germans, not the Israelites and the Greeks. But those are the major cultures of the world in the West, and of course how the West, Middle East, and East are formed, so it's not the Celts and the Greeks, are not, like the Celts and the Germanic tribes are not one of the major world's religious systems, So, in all of that, yes, we're all foreign barbarians, and we all have our various synod practices with all that. So let's see, we are getting along here. We have done, we actually already have an hour and 5 minutes. So, yeah, I am experimenting with doing these. I knew that this would, it will take some amount of time. But yes, we certainly here should cover, and please read from the notes, the passages of the Upanishads. That there is a very famous, and I have been looking for a free version of this, and I believe they're out there, and I'm trying to find a better one. The Chandogya Upanishad. I do have to pronounce some of these words carefully, and I was not raised in the culture. Was raised amongst somewhat hippies, but that's still not being raised in the Indian culture, is it? So that there is a very famous back and forth, which is very wonderful, about Jabala, a boy who goes to become a wise, leaves home to try to gain wisdom and study with teachers. So when he goes and he finds a sage to study with, a famous sage, the sage asks, what family is his mother from? What is your caste and ethnicity, according to purity laws, etc.? And Jabala, like an honest child, just spills out that his mother told him that she was young and a maid and she got pregnant and she doesn't really know who his father is. And the teacher says, wow, an honest boy. Your father must have been a Brahmin and you must be pure caste. Now, of course, this could be, on the one hand, for people, it's like, this is one of those texts where you would be a conservative, read, wow, that sage had magical powers and knew he was a Brahmin. Of course, you could also read it like the Buddha probably would and say, well, obviously it doesn't matter who's a Brahmin. And I'm a second-class non-Brahmin and I'm just going to talk like a Brahmin, because clearly who's ever a Brahmin top caste is actually who's ever honest. That's actually, it's not how you're born. Notice the text doesn't literally say that, though. So we can have more conservative people being like, he was a Brahmin, who liked the culture and believe. And then you can have people who doubt and are pushing against it during this time. Very much culture, counterculture. Again, Hegel does think that's very much the right and left of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, right and left, is very much the right and left of politics today. Not entirely perfectly, but is very much. Very much belief and solidifying the base, and doubt and pushing against and mixing things up, although it's complicated and you find everything on all sides. So the sage is basically saying, yeah, well, obviously it doesn't matter that your mother was screwing around. Like, clearly you're honest, that's what's important, and then you can wonder for yourself whether he's actually a Brahmin. I think it's kind of a joke in the text, but then again, I think some would read it that way easily and giggle. I don't know if they'd do that in temple, not Jewish temple or Christian church, but again, how much would they giggle during the sermon? I'm not sure. I don't think they call it a sermon. But after that, the sage teaches Jabala several things that are this is one of the central Upanishads in which we are taught many lessons of Hinduism, and Jabala, the boy, clearly is some bastard, like is some guy who doesn't have a steady dad. That he is any Hindu here who's being taught all the lessons of Hinduism as a very humble positioned man. As a boy, but as a non-positioned well boy, he has been being taught all of the major forms of Hinduism and what the Upanishads mean and what the Vedas mean. And this is one of the central places in the Indian tradition, most famous, where a boy who's essentially a non-caste occupying bastard is being told not only are you the Hindu, a Brahmin-ish Hindu acceptable guy, but here's all the rules for living life well, which of course does throw everything wonderfully into question as the caste system is being implemented, of course, and all of this. It's a great moment for learning about human culture. So, the sage says, in the world, as the world was beginning, the world was just being, one only, without a second. And some say it was non-being. This is Sat and Asat. And in Indian thought, you will often have an A or an AR or an AN placed in front of another word to make it negative, because these words are from the Indo-European language family. So like vertebrate, invertebrate, it is Sat and Asat are being and non-being. That is something very regular. You will see an ekantavada, that on, the AN is like invertebrate. It is the same again, and you can ask linguists. They are pretty dang sure all in agreement about that, and I'm not a linguist, but yes. And he says, so some say the world was being, some say the world was non-being. And he says that it is strange and impossible for it to be either. And yet, the being itself thought, let me create, it actually says in the text, let me procreate myself, ew. That's actually very Egypt as well. India and Egypt are very similar in odd ways very early on. And one of the things is God says, okay, I'm going to do myself and I'm going to come out as being itself. And there's an implication that it's almost like hermaphroditic sexuality, like that it's going to create itself as its own parent, and this is part of the mystery. In Egyptian stuff, check out the stuff on Egypt that I have on the website, but there's very much a being somehow created itself outside of time. I was raised sort of half Catholic as a, well, yes. I was raised with one parent Catholic, one parent somewhat Buddhistic, Taoistic kind of hippie-ishness, and with both of my parents being very left-wing, open-minded about all of this, one more traditional, one less traditional, oddly enough, like the text, and that you basically have here that both are being somewhat saying, well, it is somewhat the same, and also that there is this idea that the thing sort of mysteriously contradicts our views. And in Catholic theology, it very much is, you and I being temporary beings do not understand how immortality can create itself, because in a certain sense, from our perspective, we can't understand how a circle births itself. If we're a line and we're only a length of a line, we kind of can't understand a circle. So in a certain sense, we have to talk about it paradoxically. That's about as best of an explanation as I can offer, and I like that explanation. And then beyond that, you are welcome, again, to speculate, because these are the deepest, most spiritual, mental, of matters. Is the world logical itself? Is the world mathematical or logical? Well, it procreated and thought itself. So it mind-body created itself, according to this text. Does that make more or less sense than what you think? I don't know. Try to talk it out. You will come to non-answers very quickly. It says, as the bees prepare honey by collecting the different essences of trees, and as the honey doesn't say, well, I'm this tree or that tree, but just blends all together, that is like being itself. It says, whether it's the tiger, the lion, the wolf, the boar, the worm, the fly, the gnat, or the mosquito, they are all one. And it says, that art thou, that is self, that art thou is wonderful, old, kind of making it sound like the Bible translations of King James English for Anglophonics. That impresses them. We don't use sort of that, again, sort of old Latinish English. But yes, this is where the moment that we have most clearly Tat Tvam Asi. This is one of the most major moments of the Upanishads, in which Jabala, the boy with a questionable family life and heritage, is told, no matter who you are, no matter what side you're on, people think one thing, great philosophers, people think another thing, great philosophers. There are great philosophers who say it's solid being in fact itself. There are philosophers who say it is empty, fluid perspective and it just changes. Well, how could either be right? And that is major philosophy coming right out the gates from the beginning in stuff I can show you in Germany and France far later, and people using more modern understandings about right and left politics today, which people are wrestling with those sort of pieces back in the day. There is another hilarious passage I like. If you think that, again, people who have gods are not serious or playful about it, and then we have sciences and we are playful or independent and understanding our understandings and free-minded. There is one, a student asks one of the Vedic masters, he says, how many gods are there actually? And he says, well, there's 303 plus 3,003 minor gods. And he says, no, really, how many are there? He says, there's 33. Then he says, there's 6. And then he says, there's 3. Then he actually says, there's 1.5. And then he says, I love that. There's 1.5 gods, kid. You know that. Everybody knows that. And then finally he says, there is just one. It is breath and Brahman, like, this air that's coming in and out of you is the oneness coming in and out of you of all of this different stuff. And that is Brahman. That is the oneness, the God, which is all the gods. It's polytheistic and animistic as much as monotheistic. No, it's all the gods. It isn't the gods. It is the God. It isn't the God. It's all of that, man. So here we definitely have Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism are more... Jainism and Buddhism very much ditch a lot of gods and spirits, but then get their own kind of. It's very stripped down in Jainism. It gets more diverse with Buddhism as Buddhism continues along and gathers more gods and spirits and cultures, actually. It was probably like Jainism, stripped it all down, and then actually got more gods and saints as it went through India and China. Started picking up Guan Yin and others, such entities like that. We'll talk all about that, actually. But there's very much an Indian thought, as opposed to the other major cultures of the world, Christianity and Islam, the larger cultures. Those are Abrahamic. Those have saints and deities and spirits and jinn and angels, but they somewhat are more monotheistic and just ditch gods at all. Whereas the other Indian stuff, they still have gods and then are very monotheistic in ways that Christian mysticism and Islamic mysticism are very versed in and talk very much like the Upanishads in many ways. That is, again, no matter whether one is polytheistic, monotheistic, secular, I am definitely trying to repeat and show how much the human mind is very much the human mind, understand things in similar ways. So yes, that said, that is basically much of the thing I will talk. There's a little bit more to do about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. However, that is background on Hinduism, and I have pretty much covered the Hindu philosophy so far. So please read over the rest in the notes. I will upload this to YouTube. And again, much happiness, much material comfort, happiness, discipline. And because you're reading all, I'm going to be disciplined, make the lecture videos, and you're going to read the lectures and this stuff, and we're all going to be happy. Yeah, we're all going to make nice with the Godhead, here, and the gods and the God and the aliens and the spirits and the great big fire that is all, yes? All right, and the trucks outside. They're part of the great big fire, as is this cat. How you doing, man? Yes. Anyway, much love and happiness, guys, and material well-being, and all of this in this crazy time. And I'm going to upload this to YouTube, and I'm going to, again, this works, keep going, and all of that. Much happiness, and again, I will see you guys, or at least this camera lens, very soon.